Welcome back to Creative Conversations. Today, I finally get to talk to Ricardo, our audio engineer and the man in the chair here at Omnia Theater. If you've ever been curious about the music industry like me, or how to get your music out there as a new musician, this is definitely a conversation you're going to want to hear. From some musical basics, to the broader industry, to passion and effort, we talk about just about every step of the creative process. At the end of this conversation, we've got another song for you from Earl Jenkins, his cover of Dreams by Fleetwood Mac. All right, welcome back to another episode of Creative Conversations. Today, I finally get to talk to our audio engineer, Ricardo Germain.
At long last.
The guy...
Many episodes later.
Yes, he has been mentioned so many times, sometimes thrown under the bus, sometimes congratulatory. And today, I get to pick his brain about all things music engineering because there are so many gray areas, and it is basically a black box to me.
Well, let's make it a little less gray.
Awesome, especially with how gray the weather has been lately. That would be a welcome change.
There you go, brighten things up.
So to get started, can you run us through a little bit about what brought you to audio engineering? What about it lured you in?
Cool, yeah. I grew up playing music forever. I played since I was a kid, so I've always loved it. And what drew me into it was actually the engineering kind of came second. What really got me into it was I got to work with a producer years ago on a smaller project. I was in a band with some friends. We did a recording, we worked with a producer, and before that, I didn't even know that was a job. I didn't know that existed. But I saw that role, and I was like, oh man, that's cool. And he was also engineering at the time. He was a producer engineer in his own little sort of home studio. But that just intrigued me. I was like, man, I think I could do that. I feel like I could do that. I want to do that. So then it was probably still a number of years later, I decided to come out here for recording school. That was in Alberta that I had that sort of introduction to it, and then finally kind of pulled the trigger and thought, okay, I'm going to try and see if I can make a career in music or make that my job. So I moved out here for recording school and then started learning that side of it. I took a little bit, there was a sort of a hybrid engineering production course at that school. So I took a little bit of both sides of it. And then the realization was just kind of the engineering is sort of the gateway a little bit in at times into that producer role.
I've wondered about that. It kind of seems that way.
So back in the day, when budgets were much larger and time frames were more forgiving, you would very often, everyone would get a role. So you'd hire an individual engineer, and an individual producer, and probably an individual editor, and somebody for every job, because the money was there to do so. But now it's very outside of the sort of big, major name artists or major label affiliated artists. It's a lot more rare to have an individual producer and an individual engineer. It's far more common to see one person wearing both of those hats.
Who can afford to pay 4 people $80,000+ a year?
Well, yeah, or even just whatever chunk of the project, because it's obviously getting harder and harder to make money on music, and so that's just another hand in the pot that not everybody can really afford to have. So,
Can you speak to that a little bit? Why is it getting harder and harder to make money in music? It seems in some ways that it should be getting easier because there's so many more tools for indie creators to put their work out there.
Yeah, I think the argument would be it's easier maybe to get noticed, or there's never been a more direct route for an artist to release their music to the world, which is really cool.
Absolutely, yeah.
For years, it was how do I get on the radio? And that was how you were nobody until you were on the radio, because that was your distribution center and there was kind of only one.
Yeah.
Or if you were record it and then just hawk your CDs on the sidewalk, and that was the other thing. But yeah, so there's never been a more direct route for an artist to just record something and then upload it to a streaming service and the world has it. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't unfortunately translate into making money from that recording or from that project.
Especially for how dismally streamers pay.
Well, exactly. So that's kind of, that's kind of therein lies the problem. Is at first it was sort of the major labels that would control the money, but I would say that streaming services have kind of taken that role essentially of like gatekeeping. The like, well, we see what comes in, and we're going to give you this portion of it.
I've kind of wondered about that because I've noticed, like, I use Deezer instead of Spotify, but
Right.
in the last couple of years, especially as they've been making changes and updates to their app, like, they've made it a little bit more like Spotify in some ways, but they very much have the feel that they are curating the musical content that they give to each person, right?
Right.
And, like, it makes me wonder sometimes, like, how different is other people, like, the recommendations other people are getting versus what's pushed to me, and, like, similar for like Netflix and YouTube algorithms. Like, how do you break out of your echo chamber to find new kinds of music?
Right. Yeah. That's a tough. Yeah, it's a tough thing. I do find I struggle with this too because there was a big, big thing that came out on the news where Spotify was. I don't remember the governing body, but they were trying to change the percentage of royalties that streaming would give, and the majority of the other major services like Apple and and Tidal and all those other ones were like on board. They were like, yeah, cool, no problem. And I think it was Spotify and then maybe Amazon Music that were like protesting it and tying it up in court and like, no, we don't want to pay artists more per stream. And so that was a big thing. So I was like, oh man, like that's the worst. So
It tells you something about their business models too.
Well,
Like,
totally.
they don't care about the art. Clearly, they care about the
No,
user retention
absolutely,
and the
yeah,
money.
the bottom line. So that was a big thing. So I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to cancel my Spotify subscription. I'll go to Apple Music because that, seems fine. But if I'm really honest, I like the Spotify algorithm better. I like the Spotify interface better.
I like.
They seem to do it
using
better.
Deezer, I agree with that 100%. I
So-
even a couple years ago like did like a 3-month trial of Spotify
Yeah.
just to compare them, and like the music recommendations are better. A lot of the playlists are better.
So much better.
But-
And even just this is what drives me the most nuts. The handoff is so much better. Like, oh, I want to listen on my phone. Cool.
Oh,
I want
yeah.
to listen on my laptop. Cool. I want to listen on any other device that my Spotify account is open on. Is so easy. And I was
These
like,
are
guys,
just updated with those features, and they still don't work.
Apple doesn't even do it well. I was like, dude, are you kidding? Like, that's your whole thing is the Apple ecosystem.
Yeah,
like, for
the
a decade
interconnectedness
now,
of
it's
all
like,
of
oh,
our
like
products.
everything you have should be Apple, so they can all work together. They don't. So,
If Steve Jobs was still alive, that would not be acceptable.
yeah, not by a long shot.
They also never would have renamed it to Apple Music, I don't think.
Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. So, yeah, so I do have both accounts now, again, Spotify and Apple Music. But yeah, it's tough, because I definitely feel that, like, if I listen to an album on Spotify and the album ends, very rarely, it'll just take me into next songs that are like, yeah, cool, I'm into this. This is great. Like, very rarely do I have to like stop and be like, oh no, I no longer feel like listening to this. It just kind of knows, and it does it very well. Of just what it puts after that album that you picked.
I've never had that experience with Deezer. I always have to stop and
Right.
pick something
Right. You're
else.
like, and we're done now. Okay. Yeah. Totally.
It does have nicer features I found that Deezer seems to be better geared towards people that like to listen to like an album start to finish as like an active listening experience.
Okay.
Rather than, because like my experience with Spotify was that it is very much about playlists and music recommendations.
Right.
Whereas Deezer seems to be more about like, the artist or the band or the album that you're looking for, you go and like you can get a higher quality audio file of that album or whatever for that artist. Because
Okay.
I think Spotify caps at 320 or something like that.
I think so. Yeah.
But Deezer uses FLAC format.
Okay.
So you can, yeah.
So is it similar? Is it on par with Tidal or worse than Tidal?
I haven't
know?
actually used Tidal. So
Okay.
I'm
I haven't
not-
used it either,
I'm
but
not
I haven't
sure.
used Deezer. So, because I know Tidal, their whole thing is like the actual like .wave file. So like the exact same format that you would, have at the studio or like finish your product with is what they stream.
How much, like, what's the size comparison of a wave to like FLAC to like an MP3 or something?
I don't know the exact comparison. Wave files are they're substantially bigger for sure, because they're a lossless format, so they don't compress, so you don't lose any information. So yeah, they're significantly bigger. So like you kind of, if you're on data, watch out for that because that'll get you.
I guess that is the trade-off.
That is
the
trade-off,
yeah.
But honestly, phone plans now, everybody has tons.
Yeah.
So it's not.
I think the smallest phone plan I've seen recently was like 10 gigs.
Yeah.
Is like the minimum that people usually get with a plan now.
Totally. Yeah.
So in the ecosystem of producing versus audio engineering, can you touch a little more on like what the difference is, the nuance between those are?
Yeah, sure. So the engineer's role is sort of like strictly sonic based. So they're in charge of how everything sounds and capturing it the way. So the producer would essentially present like a vision or often like a comparison of sorts. Like, oh, okay, like I really like the way that this record sounds or the way that this artist did X, Y, or Z. Let's try and get it in that realm, sounding similarly to that. And so then the engineer would take that, listen to whatever reference and say, oh, okay, that means we probably need to use XYZ piece of gear or whatever instruments and sort of like translate that vision into like what practically do we need to do to achieve that. And then the producer role is, the approach is varied. Some producers are really, some producers came up being engineers. So they're by nature like a little bit more involved in that process.
Right.
But other producers probably came up as like maybe a songwriter. So they're not as technically inclined, but they're very musically inclined. So that relationship is always a little bit different from person to person. And that's why, often you'll see people kind of team up because they work together well, or they've just found like, oh, like you sort of understand when I say this, because there's sort of different languages, right? And there's an engineering sort of vernacular that if you're not familiar with, it can be challenging. And then there's also like music is a language in itself. So it's like,
Absolutely.
oh, like I want the kick drum to sound more pillowy.
I have no idea
what does
that
pillowy
means.
sound like? You know what I mean? So that's a real thing. And so there's a moment where you're like, oh, like someone says pillowy or fluffy or some kind of random adjective. And it's like you find people who just like you identify qualities the same way. So your pillowy matches someone else's pillowy and you're like, oh, cool, you understand. Great. That makes it so much easier.
So when you say pillowy, like my mind goes to like the sound that I get if I like punch a pillow. Is that where it's going?
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
So you would say like probably like a little bit, probably a little bit less attack. So it wouldn't be as like ticky. You'd have a little bit less top end on your kick drum, and it would sound more like a puff of low end sound versus like, like
it's almost
like hitting something with a metal
more and less
hammer
of the
versus hitting
strength.
something with a rubber mallet.
Okay.
That sort of thing.
How many, like, is it part of the educational process while being and like going through the schooling to like learn what makes different sounds that people use? Or, like, do you get exposed to 5,000 different instruments that make different noises? Or like,
Yeah,
how do
totally.
you learn where the noises come from?
Yeah, you get a lot of exposure. And again, for varying, different entry levels. Like some people are more familiar with that than others. Like, I had a pretty wide understanding of like instruments because I played music my whole life. So that wasn't as big of a learning curve for me. But some people who had, like maybe only ever played guitar or never played instruments and just wanted to get into the technical side of things. They're like, oh my gosh, all these, a guitar versus a banjo versus a mandolin, like they all look pretty similar, or like they all have strings. They all are laid out kind of the same way. They sound drastically different.
Know the nuances between them, but I
Right.
can hear that they sound different.
Yeah, and then the next step is being able to identify that in the context of a song. It's like, oh, okay, something's happening there. Something's making that noise. What do we feel that instrument is? So yeah, that happens a lot in recording school, and then just the different. Like any school for the arts, it's an introduction. They give you a really basic overview of as many things as they can to get you started.
Mhm.
And then the real learning happens in the real world as you
Honestly,
as
that's
you
not just
figure out
arts.
how to
Coming
do it.
from like mechatronics engineering, exact same deal.
Right.
Like you scratch the tiny surface
Yeah.
of what the industry is, and then you start working and you realize that like nothing they taught you in school is applicable to the real world.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say nothing in my circumstance. I wouldn't say nothing. It's certainly still applicable, but they're like, okay, here's and thankfully, the one I went to was well equipped, and you could really get a good hands-on view of sort of the major players in terms of gear that you'd come across after. But like, hey, here's 10 to 15 of some really common microphones, and it's just like, side note, there's hundreds of other microphones that you'll come across and that you'll have to learn and figure out.
Right.
But here's like the fundamentals of polar patterns and pickup patterns and dynamic versus condenser versus ribbon versus tube versus all these things.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and so they do their best to just kind of give you, again, just the basics to understand the main characteristics and the main differences. And then because at the end of the day, it's all largely preference as well, or objective based versus like, okay, we want this sound to have these characteristics. And so that starts with your source. It's like, okay, well, if you want a really punchy kick drum, you should make your kick drum in a room sound really punchy. You should set the head tension the way that it needs to be, play around with it to make it sound as punchy as possible, then pick a microphone that's going to capture that and preserve that sound that quality that you've dialed into the instrument, and then pick a preamp or, the rest of the chain of gear all should fall into the purpose of what you're trying to.
How long does that process take? Because the way you describe it there, it sounds like it could be a very lengthy process to pick exactly what you want for the right sound. But it also seems like something that like some people just like, okay, this is the mic that I use. This is where I do it. It's like, this is what I come out with, and that's like good enough for me kind of deal.
Totally. There's a lot of different, everybody kind of has their own approach to that. Two of the large ones are, this has changed a lot over time as well. In the sort of the heydays of the music industry, like the 80s and 90s and stuff like that, where you'd have these massive budgets and projects you'd take 3 to 6 months to make an album. It's just like, and that was, you'd lock out a studio, you'd be there 6-7 days a week, because you would try everything. You would try every instrument. You would just, so, okay, let's get 15 drum kits. One's going to be made of birch, one's going to be made of maple, one's going to be mahogany, one's going to be, poplar, whatever, all these things.
That's wild.
Let's get 15. Okay, let's start with, put up this kit. Okay, put them all up, mic them all up, or listen to them all first. And then you might pick a kit, you might piece it together. Okay, I like the maple kick drum with the birch snare and the, so on and so forth. You might Frankenstein a kit together of what you have. And say, okay, like bass, let's get all the basses the bass player owns, he's comfortable with. Maybe that's 1, maybe that's 12. You don't know. Okay, and then all the bass amps. Well, okay, let's see, like a handful of bass amps. Which one do we like? And that process, and that would take,
Christ.
Yeah, up until, some bands do that to some extent, but I would be hard pressed to say that it happens to the same extent that it used to happen. But that was one approach. And then, as that got condensed, it kind of sort of broke out into 2 different ways. And some people are just sort of like you said, they have their gear. It's like, oh, like this is the kick drum microphone. And part of that school of thought is that I know it's right when it sounds good coming through this microphone in a certain way. It's like, oh, okay, that's the spot. Like that's how the instrument should sound, because I know how I like it to sound through this chain, this microphone to this preamp. So I start with that every time.
Variables as they can.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I start with this every time, and if it doesn't sound right, then I know it's not the microphone, so to speak. It's like, okay, something needs to change in the room with the instrument, or some other kind of variable, where you put it in the room, or things like that.
Would they normally rent all that gear or buy it? Like, it's making me realize how much more expensive it used to be to make an album than I thought.
Absolutely. Depends. A lot of studios would have some of that gear, but often they would rent. They would look at what was available to them, and if they didn't think that was adequate and they wanted some other options, then they would rent it.
How, like, are there a lot of rental houses in the Lower Mainland? Like, how common is that? I know until I
Um,
entered the film industry, I had no idea there were all kinds of props and set deck rental houses.
right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Backline is probably the most common one now, although I think they they mostly do live stuff. Um, so yeah, I don't know if there used to be more. I'm sure there probably did, but I think that would also be like uh, more music stores would have catered to that
Mm.
in that day and age. You know, if you had a music store, it would be more common to rent things out, but that doesn't happen as
I
much. I
guess
mean, Long and McQuaid still does it, but
music stores have also, like, there's not nearly as many as there used to be.
no, they kind of went down to the chain, the big, the box
Yeah.
stores. But yeah,
How many, like, schools are there that do audio engineering in the area?
I right now there's not a ton. There's probably two or three right now, I think. And I mean, I don't think there's ever been a lot. Like at the most, there was probably five.
Seems
I
like a
think
fairly
of the
niche
major ones.
field.
Yeah, like
It's a hard industry to break into.
it's a really hard industry, and it's a small. Like that's the other thing is there's only, at best there's only ever kind of like a handful of jobs
Mm-hmm.
at established studios. Because they don't have teams of 15 or 20 people. They have teams of like 2 to 5 people at the most.
Right.
And that's probably not all at the same time. That's like a rotating schedule of like, well, we have these 5 people that work here at any given time. But, so you think of a class of, I think my class sizes were pretty small. They were like 7 or 8 people or something like that, or maybe 10.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's a graduating class of 10 people.
But yeah,
There's 5 jobs. So like,
and then
have
once those
fun.
5 jobs are filled, they're filled for the next 30 years.
Or at least a handful of years. Yeah.
Huh.
So it's
So
definitely tough to break
is it a
into.
high turnover rate job then?
Yeah, I would say yes, probably.
Yeah.
Just because it's difficult. It's difficult to make a living at because, I mean, the studio business is difficult. Nobody has the budget anymore, so it's always just like a little bit of a sliding scale. It was like, hey, like we need to keep working, so we'll get you in, but like, it's just that having that flexibility, and then, yeah. So it's something that people want different things out of it. So if you, if you want to be an engineer or a person at a big studio that has a large format console, if that's where you're bound and bent to be, then you're going to stay and you're going to figure it out and make it work. But often the allure of like, well, technology and digital stuff is getting very good. So it's like, well, you don't
Mhm.
necessarily need a large format console. You can probably spend a few $1,000 and get an okay recording setup at your house or in a room. So that's kind of the turn that most of it's taken due to there's only a handful of actual studios and the availability of
Right.
all this other stuff. So
How do indie artists make money compared to how they used to make money? Or did they even used to make money? Is it easier now? Is it harder now? Like, is it just kind of a side hustle? They make some spending money for the month, or can people actually make a living off of it?
I mean, you can certainly still make a living off it. That's definitely it's doable. I would think you try and push your streaming as much as you can, and then you play shows. I mean, most even I think with successful touring bands would say now that most of your income is in your merch sales and your ticket sales for shows is kind of where you make your most revenue. Because even if something streams really well, it's still pretty diminishing returns. Like you got to do really, really well to actually make a comfortable
Yeah,
income
you
from
need
streaming
those
alone.
economies of scale, like
Yeah.
millions of listeners every day kind of thing.
Yeah, pretty much. I can't remember the conversion, but I think I don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure it's like 1 million streams is like it might be $10,000.
Wow.
Yeah. So like think
Whew.
of how hard it is to get 1 million streams, and it's like great, you've made 10 grand. Like and then career wise in music, what can you do for that? Like you can't do an album for 10 grand. You can't,
No, that's
Could probably do a
crazy.
single for 10 grand.
Oh man.
So like that's
Oh, that
one
hurts.
song. So then it's like, okay, like, so it's tough. That's why you kind of have to have every facet of the industry working together.
Right.
Which used to be really facilitated by a label. That was the goal for a long time in
Right.
the earlier
Let
years.
the
Is
artist
like,
do
well,
the art.
if I can get a label, then it's like, okay, well, they're going to handle, my promotion, and they're going to book my tour, and they're going to help me facilitate that. They're going to make sure there's people at the shows because they're going to promote it.
Mhm.
They're going to make sure that the album gets into stores and the physical copies get distributed to as many places as possible. So they're going to help capitalize on all of those different income streams. And then they're going to take whatever percentage you work out of those income streams.
Still more than they should have, but less than the streamers apparently.
Yeah, well, it's just like, yeah. So that's changed a little bit now. Where, I mean, labels still do that. That role still exists, but they're definitely more conscious of who they take in and where that person's at. Because it used to be like, oh, no problem, we've got all these systems in place, and the market was so different that they were much more confident in what they could recoup, from that, because they were the only distributors generally, was like the major labels. Whereas now with streaming services, that's again another hand that's saying, oh, well, we're only going to give out this much. So then labels,
Right.
they're much more picky now. It's like, well, you need to have X number of monthly listeners or subscribers or whatever, and you need to be basically already streaming pretty well.
Already have your career good to go.
A lot of the groundwork. That's what if you want to get signed, you have to do ton of groundwork and on all of that really, really hard stuff. And then they'll be like, yeah, sure, great, we'll sign you, and then you get access to their network and probably some funding and different things like that. But the thing now is you're like, well, I've done all this work. I'm basically like 3/4 of the way there. Why
Yeah.
now am I going to start sharing my profits with you?
Yeah, that was going to
Because
be my next question.
yeah,
Like at that
so it's
point,
certainly
is
the
it
indie
worth
route
it?
is definitely become a much stronger choice for that reason, because it's just like everyone wants a piece of the pie, and then the pie is just seeming to get smaller. So it's like, okay, well, I want to keep as much of this for myself,
Mhm.
even though that means doing more of the work.
So how would you say that the dynamic of a label has changed throughout the last, especially like maybe 10, 15 years? Like since the indie world is getting more popular in that sense that like if I'm going to do all the work, I might as well keep all the money kind of thing. Like how common is it to still get a label deal compared to how it used to be, and is it worth it anymore? Like if you like we said, if you're putting in that much work at that point, do you just keep going on your own? If you can already get 10,000, 20,000 followers, like do you need a label?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the level that you want to reach with your sort of career. And so I do think that um past a certain point, a label does have value, because they're still going to be very networked, and they're still going to be able to get you opportunities that are significantly harder to get on your own.
Right.
In terms of like larger shows, whether that's like with booking agents or radio stuff as well. A lot of labels still have those ins, with or I guess I say radios, but really like playlists and stuff like that is kind of the alternative to that now.
Yeah, who listens to the radio
But you know what I mean?
anymore?
But they'll still have those networks and they'll be probably in with people who curate playlists. And so they can kind of guarantee, it's like, okay, yeah, I'll get you, whatever, I'll get you on this number of playlists, and that will translate to X number of streams. So it kind of depends. Like if you're, um, I guess it's probably, I don't know if this is accurate, but like in my mind, it kind of breaks down to like if you're a singer songwriter, or like maybe a smaller scale artist who doesn't have, who's not looking to put on these great big shows and not looking to, maybe do these like a stadium tour or like a bigger, like if you're fine to do, you know, smaller tours at smaller venues, you can probably facilitate that on your own, and it would be more profitable for you to do so. But if you're a band and your vision and your goal is to put on higher production shows at larger venues,
Right. Like you want to sell out 20,000 seats.
yeah, with all the lights and all the like all the stage setup and all those things.
Ramstein pyrotechnics show.
Yeah, if you want pyro, get a label. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, so that's the kind of thing. It's like if you want to break into those larger, that sort of that next bracket of artists, then a label might. I'm not gonna say it's fully necessary, but there will be value in doing that.
Right.
Because
so to be the big rock star, you still kind of need the label.
I would think so to some degree. Yeah.
Unless you happen to have a friend who already has like $500 million.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too. It's if your reach gets wide enough, it actually becomes more of a like a time versus what is that, like an effort versus reward kind of thing. So if your reach is large enough, then it actually is going to make sense to bring somebody on to be like, okay, well, my distribution's here, so it's already enough work to actually collect from all those things that I've already tapped into. So rather than me trying to write songs, play shows, collect all of the admin work that happens, it actually just becomes more sensible to be like, yes, I'm going to pay you to do it, but that's so that I can actually still have time to be an artist,
right?
And do the artist
focus
things,
on the things that
play the
people
music,
want me to
right?
do rather than all the admin stuff
Exactly.
that I need to do.
Yeah, because that still has to happen. But then it's like, okay, so.
But if you're that big, can you just at that point, why not start your own label and just promote yourself? Can you just hire people and start doing it?
You can certainly just hire people, and that's what. So a lot of people will they hire a manager first, and that's kind of the step. I don't know actually if it breaks down to like an alternative, like you get a manager or a label. Usually, if you get on with a label, they sort of assign you a manager because they have people that just you handle these 5 to 10 artists or however many, and you handle these, and that's like your day-to-day needs, or like as day-to-day, but you know what I mean, like the basic stuff of like, hey, like I'm going to the studio, I need, if I'm traveling, I need a plane ticket, I need the studio booked, I need to know these things, and so then the label will go through the manager will take care of that stuff. But some people without a label will just hire a manager, and that's also a helpful way to do that, and they'll probably have their networks as well. So, different routes, different ways to do it, but yeah, labels still have a role for sure.
Is it, and how does a label compare to, so there's a lot of different pieces in this music ecosystem, which is undoubtedly one of the reasons why there's so many hands in the pot taking all the money, right? So
totally.
there's publishers and producers and labels and distributors. Can you touch on what some of these different pieces are and what role they play in the ecosystem?
Sure. Starting with, which one do you want to start with?
Well, we've already talked about labels, so let's do. We kind of talked about would the producer work at a label then, or is the producer separate?
Sometimes. I don't think they get so much hired. It's probably just contracted by a label. So hey, we have this band based on the music that that you've done or whatever. We think you'd be a good fit to produce the record, so we're going to hire you for this project. So it's not like a
okay.
It's not like a you're on salary, everything goes through you. It's more of a freelance situation. There might be labels that have dedicated producers. I'm not sure. More common would be an engineer. Would certainly get hired or brought on by a label, especially if that label has its own studio, which most of the majors do. And that's just ensuring a level of quality. It's like, okay, we know that you can provide this level of sonic excellence, we'll call it, so that we want to make sure that all of our bands never go below that. You know what I mean? So then you're kind of the head engineer at this label. All the projects will, at some level, filter through you, just to make sure that they're all equal, quality.
So in my head, I feel like the next one is probably a publisher since distribution feels like it comes last. So what is a publisher?
I don't know a ton about publishers. I mean, I know like whoever writes the song gets the publishing rights for that song. So whenever it's played, you get some money from that. Um, but I think a publisher is also helps it get a lot of like film and TV or like sync placements, as they're called.
Okay.
But I'm actually not 100% sure of their role. So I wouldn't
So
be able to
that's
comment
a
on that a ton.
slightly separate off to the side piece?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe some managers are also publishers. So there's a little bit of crossover in that world.
Hmm.
But yeah, to be honest, I don't know enough about it.
I suppose that kind of makes sense because the publisher, if it's about like getting your song played and stuff, the manager is effectively trying to do that in
Trying to do
other
that as well.
ways.
Yeah. So I think a lot of times enough of those, there's like enough crossover between those roles that a manager kind of steps into that role or vice versa.
Okay. So what does a distributor do then?
Distributor is literally just getting, I mean, it used to be physical copies. Now it's more, again, playlists or streaming services.
Which seems a lot easier.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what, like, distributors, I would say probably still, I mean, like DistroKid or whatever is technically a distributor. So, like, a lot of those have kind of, you know, disassociated from the major label world. Like, to get a distributor, you need a label. Like, that's was kind of the thing. It's like, oh, well, how do I get my record out? It's like, oh, well, all the labels are holding hands with all the distribution companies. So if you get a label, you get the distribution. Whereas now that's largely come to kind of anyone can distribute whatever they want, wherever they want.
Kind of like Amazon publishing.
A little bit. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think they still exist. Like for the major bands that still do physical copies and stuff like that, there's still
right. Like Sony
that-
probably has their
that
own
section of it. Yeah, they definitely do. Yeah. And I believe there's also still some overlap with film and TV in terms of getting stuff, in movies or things like that. That distribution can still play a part in that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any other pieces to that ecosystem? Like what else is involved in the making and, for lack of a better word, distributing of music?
Distributing, I think that kind of covers the most of it. I mean, the manager can get broken down into like you can have a manager, you can have a tour manager, you can have different managers for different things. But yeah, I think that's most of the major ones. Yeah.
How many labels are there locally in Vancouver here?
Ooh, locally, I know of 604. I think Monster Cat is here in Vancouver.
Is that the one that you mentioned to me before was doing the like unique new way of being a label?
Yeah, they're doing some kind of cool, just like 50-50, split half the upfront cost, split half the profits, just kind of really straight ahead. Like well, yeah, I don't know if it's new, but it was just when I heard about it, and this was some years ago, it just seemed like a very refreshingly upfront approach to how a label operates, and it wasn't. There was a time where labels were kind of like, yeah, we'll set a time and then we'll put some options in. So if we want to renew it, we can. If we don't want to, we won't. But you don't really have that choice. It's kind of up to the label if it gets renewed or not. But they started kind of doing this thing where it's like, oh, like, let's just do this for let's do it for a year. And then, and then the song or the rights to the song go back to the artist. So it's like, essentially like you have the option to like, so like, let's try it basically. Like, let's come over, use our network. We'll interface, we'll help you. We'll partner up for a while. And then if you're not finding it works, or if you're not really feeling how this is, if you're not feeling you're getting enough out of it, then after a year, the contract ends. You can go bring that song now to whatever other label and you can sign it to whoever. So it's like, instead of signing the artist, they would sign a track or an album or a body of work or something like that for whatever length of time.
How big are they? Like, do you have any idea how many artists they've worked with locally?
I don't know. Yeah. But
and
there's going to be a few.
You said 604 and Monster Cat. Are there any others?
I'm sure there are. I don't know of them.
Okay, so those are the main ones.
A 604 is definitely probably the main one, I would say. They've got your big artists like I believe Nickelback's on there, Mariners Trench is on there. Michael Bublé, I think.
Was it started by a local big artist, or like how did it come to be? Do you know?
I don't know how
Especially
it started.
because like 604, I remember as a child before we had area codes. So
Right.
at some point, this studio started like no later than 95.
Right. Yeah. No, I don't know how it started.
And probably closer to 2000, because I doubt I would have remembered area codes when I was 3.
Right. Yeah. No, I'd have to look up. I'm not sure how it started or how it came to be, but
So if an artist is, say they've started just like making music in their room and they have an idea that they want to start getting their music out there, what would you say is the best way to like get started, to promote your music, to like meet people, to help you?
I mean, I think probably social media, which is, like some people are really good at it. I'm not.
I'm horrible at social
yeah,
media. I'm
so-
so bad at it.
But that's honestly the way that, and I think there's still something to be said for like going to shows and stuff and interacting with the local music scene as much as you can. So yeah, I mean, if depends on where you're at. Like if you're a solo artist and you want a band, or like if you want to stay that format of just like you and an instrument, there's different kind of things. But yeah, honestly, social media is the best start to just let people know what you're doing, let people hear what you're doing.
Is there any particular platform that's like best or preferred for musicians, or is it just kind of
Oh,
like
good question.
whichever has the most eyes and whichever one you're best at?
Yeah, I mean, kind of try them all, to be honest. TikTok has been doing some crazy things for music.
I hate that TikTok is so popular.
I know it's a little tough, but
It drives me nuts that we have to use it for promotional purposes.
yeah, but it's definitely it's had an undeniable impact on the music industry, which is really crazy.
The social media industry as a whole, like pushing content out, like it has changed Facebook's plan. Like it remodeled Instagram because of how popular it was.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I mean, in terms of like, it's funny, like old songs coming back, or breaking new songs. Like kids will just find a clip of a song, and it's just like it goes viral on TikTok, and then that opens the door for the artist to do some more stuff. So yeah, TikTok's probably a safe bet. But I mean, honestly, like again, it's the more eyes, the better. So I would say try them all as best you can, or pick a few
Right.
that you're maybe most familiar with or at least comfortable with, and start there. Yeah.
Do you have any notes on finding the right audience for your listeners? Like, because there's going to be a drastically different range of people depending on what genres you like, what genre the singer-songwriter is trying to be, which, I mean, genres is another whole, like, what even is a
that's
genre
kinda tough.
anymore?
I think I don't really know if there's a strategy for that. I think it's just, at least I would say it's just like cast as wide a net as you can, and you'll find, you know what I mean. Like your audience will make itself known to you. You'll be able to figure out, who's listening, and then especially if you're using a distributor like DistroKid, you can actually see where they're listening to.
I
which
guess,
is kinda neat.
any online distribution thing gives you all kinds of
all that
analytics,
back end info. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So, yeah, I would say just get as widely known or get as much exposure as you can, and then you'll be able to tell what's working and what's not. Kind of, I mean, it's not a super specific answer, but it also is a little bit different for everybody, So yeah, social media, good place to start, and then just make it known what you need, basically. Like if you need to record something and you don't have the know-how or you don't have the means, then like, make a little video and put that in the description, like looking for, or if you're trying to write music and you're looking for a collaborator, make that known, like just put your needs out there, and then people, the music industry is all about hustling. So it's like as much as you are trying to find that role, someone is out there trying to fill that role.
I guess we will take a break. All right, and we're back.
We're back.
We are going to start this half with me asking you about creativity before we dive back into music. So we actually touch on something that my podcast is about.
Plot twist. It's about creativity. Didn't see that one coming.
What? So tell us, what does creativity mean to you?
Well, so I've had the unique pleasure of thinking about this question as I've listened
You've
to
heard
you
it
ask
so
it.
many times.
Yeah. So I was driving here this morning, and I was like, all right, what am I going to answer to this question? And so I think that sort of ultimately at the end of the day, what creativity is it's sort of an outward representation of your imagination. So it's your imagination making its way out of your brain into your hands, into something that exists in the real world.
How would you compare that to art?
Compare it to art? I think
That sounds like essentially the same thing to me.
Yeah, well, but I mean, art is a pretty wide, term.
That's
so I think
true. It is very
making
reaching
music
and broad.
is artistic, painting is artistic, building is artistic.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all kinds of, those are all outlets of creativity. So you're creating something, you're making something, but I think your imagination has to be involved in that. If you call something creative, I think, because you had to come up with it. You had to conjure what that was going to be or do or look like or sound like. So I think it's just, I think it's like an outward representation of your imagination, basically. Exercising your imagination.
Right. Intentional utilization.
Bringing it into the world. I think that's the sort of that moment where thought meets action. You've internally pictured something or maybe heard something or whatever. And then that's creativity is the moment that you put that into action.
Okay. So does it necessitate something that other people can see or interact with in any way, or can it be individual for a singular person?
That one I don't know. I don't know if it needs to physically exist. I mean, like, can you have, like, I guess the question kind of is like, can you have a creative thought? Versus like,
that's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't actually fully know. I'm still kind of thinking that out, but I think, I don't know. I think my initial reaction is that for it to be fully creative, I think it actually has to like sort of follow through and be accomplished.
Okay. Okay. So here's a bit of a meta twist. So if we ask any listeners or viewers to leave a comment on whether or not they think a thought can be creative, is putting it into the comment actualizing it enough to make it a creative thought? Or does it become not a thought since you wrote a comment about it? Leave your comments.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's your cue. I guess that would be like, can an opinion be creative? Or does it just make it a unique opinion?
Can an opinion be creative? I need to ponder this.
That's what I mean. So, but hopefully this is a neat little, I thought that was an interesting answer because of all these things that it kind of poses at the same time as it answers.
Yeah. I also find it, I'm kind of curious, like, how much of this answer, like, has it been inspired from you and your past experiences in life and whatnot versus how much is it inspired by all of the different people you've heard giving answers about creativity so far?
I mean, it's definitely both. But
yeah,
I don't know. I wanted to, I do feel like it's rooted in my own experience though, in terms of like, how do you be creative? It's like, well, you involve your imagination in what you're doing. And I think that's inherently, if you're doing even a mundane task that you already know how to do and you stop and go, I'm going to intentionally imagine another way this could be done. That's being creative, I think, by definition. You know what I mean? Or like,
yeah, absolutely.
So I guess maybe to reframe, maybe maybe that's the definition of creativity then, is intentionally involving your imagination in whatever it is you're doing.
Okay. I like that because there is definitely a lot of interactions and or experiences in life where you can tell either yourself or the other person involved has just like not put thought into what their actions at
Right.
all. Like,
So that moment where you stop and go, okay, here's a way to do it. What's another way? How can I rephrase or reform, or how can I come up with an alternative? How do you imagine an alternative? So I think that's what creativity is. It's intentionally involving your imagination in whatever you're doing, thinking, writing, commenting, um, anything.
and how do you have any examples of ways that you might apply this to when you are mixing a track?
Oh gosh, everything you do in mixing a track. And I was thinking about this too, because that process and just the whole working in music in general is really is a tough sort of transition. At least it was for me. I had a very structured upbringing. And so my life before I worked in music, right from a very early age, was always there's a right and a wrong way to do something. And there's always someone standing there saying, yes, we do this, we don't do this. This is right, this is wrong. Here's the way, here's not the way. And then I get to recording school, and the first project you hand in, and you're like, okay, here it is. I did what you asked. Is this right? And they go, is that how you wanted it to sound? You go, well, yeah, I guess. Cool, then it's right. What do you mean? So like, it really is a massive shift, as I'm sure bigger for some than others, but for me at least, it was a very stark contrast to everything else I'd ever done, where there's always like, there's a correct and there's an incorrect. And this is, especially in mixing, it's like, well, if it sounds good, then it's right. It's like, that's the most specific and the most vague it gets. So it's like, oh,
And especially because
cool.
like it's gonna sound different to everybody that listens.
It's going to sound different
to
to everybody that listens. Everybody's going to hear different things to some extent. So yeah, that's kind of the journey that you go on, and it's a cool one, but it's also a challenging one in that you have to keep your head up, and you have to keep looking around and noticing what other people do, and how that affects the final product. And you, to some degree, you have to compare your final product to other final products that exist to know where you're at in the interest of your own personal growth. You know what I mean?
Right.
In the interest of not just being, well, I do it this way and that's the only way. It's like, well, no, you should, in the interest of being creative, it's like, well, what are the other ways? Because
Right.
everybody's going to do it a little different. So you're like, okay, well, how do they do it? And how do they do it? So there's a natural element of observing that should take place, but the challenge comes that it's very quickly followed by our human nature of comparing and saying, oh, well, is that better than mine? Are they further ahead than me? Am I doing it wrong and they're doing it right?
I feel like there's got to be a lot of nuance to that kind of comparison to like do it properly too.
It's really
because,
hard.
Like,
it's very easy to get discouraged.
I can imagine so, yeah, because like you do need to compare certain things, like are these sounds too loud? Are they overwhelming? Is there distortion? That kind of stuff.
Totally.
Like, are there mouth noises? But at the same time, you need to appreciate and understand that your track is different. So like the final values or like amplitude of those frequencies are going to be different in your track. You can't just carbon copy the same work that they did.
Exactly. And that's the other, sort of the more creative side of it, because there's a technical side to it as well. And especially in those comparatives or comparisons, it's, there's that technical element of loudness and volume and frequency spectrum and what's prominent and what's not. But then there's also the creative element of like, well, what's best for the song? You know what I mean? How do you make the song the most authentic and the best that it can be, sort of, for, it sounds a little bit weird to say, but for what it wants to be. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So in terms of like, you wouldn't compare an indie folk song to a major rock song and say, oh, well, it's not as loud and it's not as energetic, so it's not as good. Like, that's not
Apples
a
to
real
oranges.
comparison,
Yeah.
right? So then it's like, okay, well, what does this want to be in and of its own right? And how do I still make sure that it's sort of as good as whatever else is around, but still make it its own authentic creation?
Right.
So it's a very interesting line to walk, and I'm still navigating it myself, and I probably will be for the rest of my career. But that's the other sort of mindset shift is like I really don't know, and people maybe farther down the road in this journey would maybe be able to correct me, but I don't really know if that ever actually clicks. You ever actually get to that point where you're like, oh, no, I've got this figured out. I'm good. I have no self-doubt anymore.
I mean, I
That
feel
never
like
really goes away. Like, you're always going to be, because there's millions of other people doing this.
yeah,
And there's always going to be somebody, I mean, I hope there's always somebody that's going to be pushing the envelope
absolutely.
and doing things a little different or maybe a little better or not better, but doing it in a way that maybe has a little bit more eyes on it, that gets a little bit more of attention, it gets a little bit more popularity. Because you have to remember too that, people's idea of success is different too.
Very much so.
So
Yeah.
it's like, well, if your goal was the most popularity, then this is the best way. Or if your goal, you know what I mean? But if your
Right.
goal was, I don't know, the most authentic, like, we didn't use any plugins, we only used analog gear. You know what I mean? Like, if your goal is the most pure workflow, then it's
Right.
like, okay, well, then there's going to be a different way than the most popularity way of accomplishing that goal.
Almost more like a creative experiment at that
Exactly.
point.
And if you've, and then by those margins, if you've done it that way, you're successful because that's what you set out to do.
Yeah.
So it's a really,
more of a focus on the journey than the end.
it's a wide open sort of field that you're stepping through. Like the analogy or like I don't know, the image that I get in my head is just like a cornfield where you're like, it's over your head and you're just kind of like walking through and you'll like come across somebody and be like, oh, hey. And then you'll peek back at their path and be like, how did you get here? And it's like, oh, cool. Yours is so different than mine, but we're at relatively the same place. Don't know where we're both going.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? So it's like those kind of interactions where you just like check in along the way.
That's a
and
neat
you're like,
analogy. I like that.
it's interesting. It feels very like sort of arbitrary at times or just like mysterious. You're just like, what? Have I done it right? Have I done it wrong? Am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? And there's really no answer to that. It's just however you got here is the right way for you to get here. And
yes, everyone has their own path.
Yeah. And you extrapolate that into the workflow itself of however the way that you want to record it that sounds good and gets you a good final product is the right way for you to record it.
Which is maybe not always the most helpful advice, but if you...
Exactly. It's probably the least... Well, yeah. On the surface, it's probably the least helpful advice.
Yeah.
But when you...
Just meditate on it for like 10 or 12 hours.
Well, but continue to apply it is really the thing, is you have to be in those situations and say, okay, well, the way that I know or the way that I've, determined is going to get me the result that I need with what I know right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the other thing, is you have to leave that open to growth and to another stage where you're going to eventually probably hit a point where you'll look back and be like, oh, that was probably the worst way I could have done that. But to me, that's the marker of sort of success, of doing it right, is you should be able to look back and say, oh, I'm definitely farther ahead than I was at that point in time. And you go back, like even for an engineer or mixer or producer, you go back and you listen to some of your older projects. You're like, oh, I'm very confident that I could do that better now than I did then.
Yeah, like when we have 100 podcasts out and I go back and listen to the first couple and cringe at myself.
Right. It's like, oh, I'm very, I know very confidently I could do it better now than I could have then. And I think that's...
At least here's hoping I could podcast 100 better than I could one.
Right. So to me, those are the sort of markers that you should look for and sort of along your journey. It's just like, well, I've moved forward, and because there will always be there will always be farther to go, you know? So it's like, kind of like you said earlier, it is really like learn to enjoy the journey and focus less on the destination because that destination is different for everybody. So it gets really confusing if you're like, oh, well, I'm not at that person's destination, so I must have messed up somewhere along the line. It's like, well, that's not the case at all. You know, it's like you're gonna be at your own destination, which could look years and miles different than someone else's.
Or it could look like the same corn stalk.
100%. 100%. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really like that part that you mentioned about like not being sure if there is a point where someone has no more self-doubt and they're just like completely convinced that they know what they're doing from that point on. Because I think if anyone gets to that point, they have effectively given up. There's a quote from, I believe it was a Richard Bach book that I read. It said, and he might not even have been the first person to write it, for all I know, but if we don't grow, we rot. Right. And like that's, I mean, it's true about plants. I think it's very true about people. Like if we get to a point where we have stopped learning and stopped trying to improve our skills, then that is the day that like, that is the first day of the last stretch of our lives because we will probably not be here much longer.
Yeah.
Or at least maybe be physically here, but like mentally checked out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a tough, relating that back to music and people that have done this for, decades upon decades, and they have a very solid workflow that they're so confident in and stuff like that. But I still think it's important to, to just keep sort of keep your head up and keep looking around and keep just being aware of what else is changing and that there's other ways. And, I think the really best engineers are always open to refining their workflow and finding,
Well, especially with like the way that technology and society changes around us, there's always going to be new things to play off of.
Exactly. And I think even if it's not a better result, then it's like a faster way of getting there or like a more efficient, you're streamlining your workflow. Okay. Yeah. Now that I know how to get what I want, how do I get it, easier, or how do I get it quicker?
Instead of doing it in 6 months, how do I do it in 4 or 5?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm really curious now, actually, because you had mentioned before making an album used to take like 6-ish months, kind of a deal. So maybe let's start with a single song first, since it's easier to break down than a whole album. But like, what's the timeline on making a single and like to produce it, to mix it, master it, like distribute it, ideate it? Like how long does it usually take for artists? Well, I mean, I know that's going to vary drastically.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's literally so different. So, I mean, honestly, like there's no, and this is kind of, I hate to answer so many things with like the sort of artsy, like very vague metaphorical answer, but it's kind of the real answer in terms of like it can be very different. It will be very different for every person, every songwriter, but also every song. There are songs that people write overnight and they're fantastic. They wrote it in 2 hours and they, actually a funny example. So the Top Gun movie that came out recently, the remake one. So One Republic did a single for that.
Oh, like 1999 one or whatever.
Yeah, it's I Ain't Worried About It.
Yeah.
And so it was really cool. They posted an interview and it was Tom Cruise talking about how they had a meeting and they're like, yeah, so this is the scene that it's going to play in and this is kind of the feeling that we want it to have and this and that. Here's our expectations, whatever. And he says in the interviews, this was like a Wednesday afternoon or something like that. Thursday night, they gave us the song, and that was it. It was perfect. It was done.
Damn.
So
wow,
Ryan Tedder is an exceptionally fantastic at what he does. So that is impressive. That's their thing, and that's not to say I think any really sought after, desired producer, songwriter usually has a handful of ideas on the go. They usually have some tracks that they started some idea floating around.
I know, yeah, like probably a lot of creatives are like this, but I know like I have a journal list of like story ideas for things that I might write later, or
Exactly.
lyric concepts
Yeah.
for like I don't even make music and I have a journal of lyrics.
Right. So similarly, there's probably, probably a couple of tunes that he had just sort of tucked away. So
Mhm.
maybe it was just lyrics on top of that and done, because you're like, oh, like I know this is a good idea. I just don't know the application for it yet. So very much could have been something like that. But
Right.
that's still kind of like, that's still a single. That's still a
Yeah.
day.
I mean, and it's been a popular song after that movie. It was on the radio for a long
Hugely
time.
popular.
Definitely coming up in a lot of Spotify playlists.
Yeah. So that's one example. And then there's other examples. I don't have one offhand, but songs that people work on and sleep on and work at tirelessly until it feels right to them. So sometimes it takes years.
I don't have anything to back this up, but I have a sense or a feeling that is kind of how Hozier approaches his music.
Okay.
Because it feels like he vanishes for a few years. It
Right.
takes him a really long time to put out an album, but when he puts it out, it just like it feels so well polished and put together.
Cool. Yeah. I've heard artists say too that it's like, I mean, there's like times of inspiration in their life. And so there's like that gap where it's like, oh, like life is just kind of happening and things are just kind of chill and I don't feel the need to, or I don't have anything really to say at this moment in time.
Right.
And so, and that's obviously super valid. Because I think it's like you want your work to be inspired and you want your work to come from a place of I wanted to say this, or I had this, or this happened to me, and this is me expressing about it, emoting about it.
Mhm.
So yeah, so I think that's could be that too. It's just like, yeah, I finished this chapter sort of, and then I'm collecting ideas, I'm collecting material, or I'm just taking a break because sometimes that's really
That is often how I feel like through my writing process is
Right.
like I'll write for an 8-month stretch and then put it down and not write for an 8-month stretch
Right.
and like feel like I've gotten no new ideas to cover.
Well,
Then
there's
that 8 months.
science about that too, in terms of like learning to. I think it relates more to like learning to do something. So you're practicing, but there's actually it's very beneficial to actually take a little bit of a break and let your brain sort of almost digest what you've tried to teach it, and then come back to it again. So
Yeah, on that point, I have noticed almost every single time I've been, whether it's like playing a video game, learning something new, or like even at school, like when I failed Calc 3, coming back to Calc 3 the second time, it just felt like 3 times easier than
Right.
it did the first time. And I
totally.
did not pay attention more. I promise I did
promise.
not pay attention more, but it
Yeah.
was just easier being exposed to it the second time around.
For sure. For sure. And there's also, I think there's something to be said about, when we do the same thing day in and day out, it inevitably is going to get to some degree monotonous.
Mhm.
So there's something really valid about you take that break until there's like the desire comes back to do it.
Yeah.
And that's automatically going to bring some sort of inspiration to the work because you want it. You crave.
Well, and when
I
that fire
want.
lights,
Yeah.
like you hyper focus and you get so much more done.
Yeah.
You work way more efficiently.
Yeah. And naturally you'll prioritize it because it's something that you want to do.
Yeah,
So there's,
absolutely.
that's a valid method as well. But I think to more answer your question, like in terms of if you have a song that's written, and I think this is what you're asking, is how long it would take to record the song, mix the song, release
Yeah.
the song. So if you came into a studio, I mean, there's a couple of different variables, but if it's one song, you should be able to do it in a day, for the most part, depending on how intense maybe not a day, a couple of days, we'll say. If it's like, we'll say it's a full band track. So it's got all the instruments, bass, drums, guitar, probably some keys, some extra production. Maybe there's a shaker, maybe there's a tambourine. There's vocals. Inevitably, there's probably going to be a few layers of vocals, maybe some harmonies, maybe some background stuff. If you are super well prepared, if you're a band, if you're really well rehearsed, or the alternative, if it's an artist and they've hired session musicians, which are people who play their instrument for a living, and they get hired to play on people's records. So they're often very good and very efficient at what they do. So if you're well rehearsed, or if you have great session musicians and you're doing one song, it is feasible to come into a studio, record the instruments for a song, probably break for lunch, get the vocalist in, do a bunch of vocal takes. And I mean, this is, again, feasible. It's not necessarily like, it's hard to sing for a lot of hours, so it's not always feasible to do all of the vocals for one song in one day. That can be a stretch. But it's feasible if you didn't
I feel
have
that singing in the car for 8 hours on the
Right.
way to Quesnel is
Right. Yeah, you get out and you're like, oh, what have I done? So it's feasible, if there's not an insane number of vocals, and if your vocalist is sort of prepared and they practice often, so it's not too strenuous for them to sing for a long period of time. It's feasible to get all of your tracking done in a day, or maybe 2 at the most, and then not at the most, but 1 or 2, depending on the level of production, basically, that you're trying to do, how many instruments you have to record, how many vocal layers you want to do.
Is there a common, like the common range of the number of instruments that are in a song, or like sounds in a track?
I think it depends on the genre, and also the genre at any given point in history. So like pop music right now, I would say is leaning towards like a definitely a more minimalist approach, where there's not a ton of different instruments per se. It's usually just kind of like a core beat and like, a synth pad maybe or something like that for the verse, and then there's maybe 2 or 3 other instruments that come in maybe for the chorus, but it's pretty stripped down for the most part. So, versus, pop music in the 80s would be like, oh my gosh, there's drums, there's 17 synths, there's a guitar, there's a bass, there's every sound you can think of just packed into a massive production of a song. So that all really depends. It's kind of just where you're aiming is going to dictate what you put in the song.
I've always wondered, for session musicians, do they rehearse with an artist beforehand or like on the day? Or how does a session musician know the artist's song to play it in the recording studio?
Yeah, it depends. Sometimes there's definitely days where they show up, they've never heard it before, and the artist has like a demo of some kind. Maybe it's just them singing it to an acoustic, or maybe they've tried to add a couple of other ideas that they heard and that they want to explore more. So there's definitely days where they've come in, hear it for the first time, they write down, they make a chart, so they, what key it's in, what the chord changes are, when they happen, and then they go out and play it. And on those particular sessions, there's usually a producer, thankfully, who again is the guy with the vision of how this project or this recording should feel, should sound. And so then it's just, what the musician's delivering, and the producer kind of hears it and says, okay, well, this should change a little bit. That should change a little bit. This isn't working for me. Let's add, change this rhythm or change this part. And maybe there's a chord change. Maybe there's, an arrangement change of some sort. And that kind of just falls to the producer.
So,
or if the artist doesn't have a
session
producer.
musicians make up part of the melody? Or actually, before we go there, I want to ask you, because I am such a noob, can you please describe like what is a melody versus a harmony versus like a rhythm? Like, give us a very intro baseline. I probably shouldn't have waited for an hour into the podcast for this, but just so that we're all on the same page, mostly so I'm on the same page.
Goodness. Okay, so melody, melody is typically what like the singer would sing. So the pattern of notes or the order of notes that they would sing, versus a harmony is like a corresponding. It's usually, there's a whole bunch you could do. It's usually it's one of the notes that would make up that chord. So like the third note or the fifth note, or sometimes a fourth. And so that changes in relation to the melody. And so if the melody is at a certain note, then the harmony would either be, 3 notes above it, 5 notes above it, 3 notes below it, 4 notes below it. So there's always several options to do as harmonies, but it's a corresponding note that would be in that chord. So if the note is singing a C, then the harmony is going to be one of the other notes in a
So
C
is
chord.
there a difference
generally.
between a harmony and backup vocals, or are they just the same thing?
There's usually, there's not a huge difference. I mean, typically, if you have like a dedicated backup vocal, it sort of implies that they're singing like they're reinforcing the melody. So they're usually singing either the same thing or a different part, like a different melody.
Okay.
Like they're their own part of the song, the background vocals. Whereas a harmony is generally is usually nowadays it's usually the singer harmonizing with themselves. They usually do it, they do another track and do another take, and they would harmonize with their own.
Oh, good. That was another question I was going to ask you.
Yeah, with their lead vocal. Or, if it's a band, of course, there's usually another member of the band. If it's, the lead singer does a melody, sometimes the guitar player will do a harmony, or one of the other members who sings. But yeah, and then background vocals, harmonies can certainly fall under that umbrella for sure. But I think usually if you're going to call something background vocals, it sort of infers that they have their own part to sing.
Okay.
That is either, reinforcing, like maybe a gang vocal. Maybe there's 2 or 3 people sort of hollering the same thing to emphasize a lyric underneath the lead vocal, or they're doing some kind of supportive melody or echoing a lyric maybe after it happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. What was the first part of that I asked you before? The harmony and backtrack.
Difference between harmony and melody, I think, was the first one I remember.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So like rhythm is that mostly drums then? Is it all drums? Is it
Everything has a rhythm.
Okay. So when like if you said like if you told me to check out this rhythm, like what would you be meaning by that? Or like is that even the right way to say that? I should have had a better example.
I probably wouldn't phrase it like that. Unless you're going to be more specific. So you could say, check out this guitar rhythm, or check out this bass rhythm, or because everything is playing a rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
And everything is, people are singing in a rhythm.
But not
it's
everything
going to
is
fall
playing
on
a
one
melody?
of the, correct. Not everything is playing a melody.
Okay.
Drums would not play a melody, generally.
Gotcha. Okay.
You could argue that if you had like toms that were tuned really high, like maybe like the Phil Collins, like In the Air Tonight.
All right,
you could
all right.
argue that is a melody because there are specific notes that are happening in a sequence. So, but generally speaking, drums would not play a melody.
Okay.
They would strictly play rhythms. Whereas bass is really cool because it's kind of you could say it's like the bridge between rhythm and melody. So
Interesting. Okay.
yeah, so the bass is generally always going to want to sync up with the kick drum and happen usually at the same time. But they're also playing notes that have to line up with, let's say, the guitar.
Right.
So they're kind of like, guitar can happen very independently of what the drums are doing. It's not necessarily dictated by.
I didn't know there was that close of a connection between bass and drums.
Bass and drums, yeah, they're referred to generally as the bottom end.
Okay.
That's the bottom end, is the bass and the drums. Like, or you could sometimes the rhythm section also gets.
I've heard that term before, and I had no idea what it meant.
Yeah, because they're very complementary to each other. They're often very strongly based. The drums or the bass, is very strongly based. These things write themselves on what the drums are doing. And then also playing a corresponding melody that kind of bridges the gap to the melody instruments, or the guitar, or the keys, or the chords that are happening in the song. And yeah, it's neat because it's usually a stripped down, like bass plays, for the most part, individual notes, which are usually like the fundamental note that's happening. So if they're playing a C chord, the bass player is playing a C, where the keys player would be playing a C, a D, and a something else, 3 chords that make up. I'm bad at theory, so I don't know.
Better than me.
But they're playing, 3 to 5 notes, whatever, that make up that chord. Whereas the bass player is only generally playing the fundamental.
Right.
So that's kind of why those things go together. And then, but everybody's playing a rhythm still at the same time, that are usually complementary to some degree. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
So in the process of recording a song, like, what's your favorite part? Like, do you like the part where the musicians are actually playing instruments? Do you prefer like the mixing it and treating it afterwards?
My favorite part is in those that in that moment where everybody's playing it for the first time. Is really
Specifically the first time.
well,
Or just,
yeah,
like, the
discovering
recording
it, that
Okay.
process, that time where people are sitting down, hashing it out, because it's so incredible to watch. Because you hear the demo, you hear somebody, and maybe it's their iPhone. They've literally sat in front of and sang and played into an iPhone. You're like, here's
Recorded
this
on the iPhone 14.
exactly, yeah. Like, here's this idea, here's this thing that I came up with by myself in a room, and it's again, it's watching someone's creativity, someone's imagination leave their body and be interpreted and actualized by other human beings.
Astral project their creativity right into your ears.
Well, and it's crazy, right? Because they're like, oh, like, as much as there's a framework of, okay, we're in this key, which means we're limited to this section of chords, this section of notes. There's still so many variables to be interpreted. And there's still so many options that people can bring to the table and say, well, what if it was like this? What if it was like that? And that will inspire what one person does will very heavily inspire what another person does. And it'll set them off on this train of thought. And so it's really, really amazing. And that to me is where the term, or the most accurate depiction of the phrase studio magic. Like, you know what I mean? People will say, like, oh, like studio magic. And that they usually refer to it as like, oh, like it sounded bad and now it sounds good. Or it sounds, it sounded small and now it sounds big, or thin and now it sounds full. Like, oh, studio magic. But to me, it's like, it's those moments where it's like people came to a studio to be in the same room, to watch someone else play and have that affect the way that they play. And that, yeah, there's an air of magic to that, where it's just like, oh, like this couldn't happen any other way. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Like, that's so important for a lot of creative endeavors. Like, I think that's one of the things that, like, maybe the world is struggling with, or maybe some people have COVID kind of threw people under the bus in the sense that it convinced everyone that everything could be done digitally and remotely.
Right.
But not all creative endeavors can be done remotely.
Totally.
And I know there are examples of phenomenal music that have been done in like completely different cities, sometimes even different countries.
Yep. Definitely happens.
But it's just like, on the note of the like studio magic or whatever. Did you say studio or music magic?
Studio magic, yeah.
There's just such a different vibe. And like, I'm kind of comparing this to around like what we've been doing in our space lately,
Right.
like working on this, is just, it feels different to be working with a group in person, collaborating on ideas real time, rather than sending a message, waiting for 20 minutes to get a response.
Absolutely.
Or 3 hours.
Yep.
It completely breaks the flow.
Totally.
Yeah, so try more in-person collaborations, people. It'll make you happier.
It's definitely, I mean, and again, so much of the music industry is like, it's not to say that this is the only way to do it. You know what I mean? There's tons of music where it's like, oh,
yeah,
like we sent,
like you talked about earlier.
we did
there's
drums
a
and
million
bass, and we
ways.
sent it to a guitar player who's in Nashville. He's going to play the guitar on it. It's like, cool, great. He's a great player. It's going to be awesome. Like,
How does that kind of connection happen? Like, how does a vocalist from here get a guitar player from Nashville? How does that just happen?
sometimes it's through social media. Other times it's, in my experience from what I've seen, that's typically the producer, who will just have those connections. Either they've worked with them in the past, or, friend of a friend, It's like, oh, like the drummer knows, like the drummer played with this guy on whatever occasion and he was great. He also happens to do some remote work. So on his recommendation, we're going to send him the track and see what he does. So yeah, from what I see, most of the time it's usually the producer or the engineer or one of the musicians who has that connection. So yeah. So yeah, not the only way to do it. There's great projects that don't happen all in the same room, tons. But yeah, I would argue that there is still something about recording all together. If for nothing more than just the memory of that interaction.
Well, yeah. I
Like,
mean,
you know what I mean? Like everyone walks away with a sense of like, oh, that was a special project because, we were all there. We all felt together. We all discovered together.
Yeah, it's a bonding experience as much as anything.
Totally.
And what is life for if not enjoy?
Yeah. No, it's really cool. So that's my favorite part for sure. I do really enjoy mixing. Although, again, I'm on that journey, so that is sort of more riddled with that sense of like, well, is this the right way? Is there, because there's a million and one ways to do it. And everything works different for every person. And so it's that self, managing that self-doubt is a much tougher battle in the mixing moments than it is. And I mean, there's still a little bit if you're engineering for those live off the floor moments. That's definitely a high pressure situation because everybody's there. And you want to make sure that you capture everything correctly or in a meaningful way the first time. And because the pressure with that is that you never know when someone's going to have that magical idea. And there's always, no matter how good of a player you are, there's still always something about the first time that something happens because you can't rehear it for the first time.
Yes,
so no matter what,
always a magic to first
there's
time.
There's always going to be something about, and whether that's completely made up or not, but kind of like you've talked about before, if something is real to you in your mind, who's to say it's not actually real? You know what I mean? So even if you're just fabricating, there's some magic dust on that first take. You're still going to hear it and go,
you feel the magic
dust, right?
The magic is real for you.
Exactly. So there's still, there's always going to be something about that. So you always want to make sure, that you're ready for those moments and that you've sussed everything out and you're not going to have any problems and there's not going to be anything compromising that great moment.
Appreciating those little magic moments in life is a great way to help you enjoy your life more too.
Totally.
There was a little shift in me in this last year where I had started, it was actually kind of similar. It might have been from a movie I watched actually, but the movie, I can't remember the title of it exactly, but the premise was essentially about the little perfect moments in life. And this guy is reliving the same day over and over again. And he thinks the way to break out of it is to identify all of the little perfect moments in his town in that day.
Interesting.
And it's a movie, a very heartwarming story about just taking in the moment and enjoying all the perfect little things that happen around you every day.
Right.
And it opened my eyes to how true that is. There's so many truth is stranger than fiction kind of stories, right? Where you're walking down the street and maybe you're watching some kids play basketball and some kid just overhand whips the basketball across the court and everyone thinks it's going to go out of the court and he manages to sink it somehow and you're he could never repeat that. It was super cool to see it. And that's even not a very exciting example because I couldn't think of a better one, but I have been melted with joy at finding these little moments ever since watching that movie.
Yeah, totally. No, it's valid. And that just speaks to your whole, the perspective of how you go throughout your day is expecting to find those versus no expectation of well, nothing really great is supposed to happen today. So probably nothing great will happen today or nothing outstanding is going to take place. But if you're looking for them, if you're expecting, then you're more likely, not to say that you create them, but you're more likely to find one.
Yeah, definitely more likely to appreciate one for sure. I've wanted to talk to you. This is kind of actually related to the topic that we've been on, but about band dynamics. So, like, kind of on the note of studio magic and like recording with your band for the first time, kind of compared to being like a solo artist and just having musicians, like, what are the differences between being in a band that is like a coherent group? You guys are there to like do the dream together versus like a solo artist with like supporting musicians kind of thing.
Right. Um, I mean, there's tons of differences. I think in how it relates to like recording. Um, with a band, you're definitely um, you have to manage expectations more, and you have to manage people's involvement more, and definitely their egos as well. Because in a band, the expectation a lot of the time is that there's sort of equal contribution. And so each, if the bass player has an idea for a vocal melody, then the singer, in an ideal circumstance would kind of hear him out. And say, okay, let's try it. And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But there's tons of scenarios where someone's like, oh, well, I think that idea is better and I think you should do it. And the other person says, well, I disagree. And I'm the singer, so I'm going to sing what I want to sing.
And then things get awkward.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously that's not every band. Like lots of bands work great, but there's far more opportunity for those situations to arise. Whereas in a session musician situation, it's usually that discussion will not happen among the players. That will be between the artist and the producer. If someone does something that either works or doesn't work, then typically the artist or the producer will speak up and be like, hey, like that didn't work for me. And then maybe the producer will be like, oh, really? I liked it because this reason. And the artist goes, yeah, but it doesn't feel authentic, or that's not something I ever heard the song doing. And okay, cool. Yeah. And then they sort of work that out and then would go back to the players and be like, yeah, it's a yes or it's a no, or we need to find something different. The player goes, cool. Because they're not, at least the, good established session musicians are not precious about their ideas at all. They want to bring,
Guess that makes sense.
They want to bring everything to the table that they can. They want to give you as many options as they can. And the really, really good ones, and this is also probably up there with my other favorite moments, is the time where they sort of, the floor gets turned over to, and this is usually, at least in my mind, it's usually the guitar solos moment or the guitar overdubs moment where they're like, okay, we've got the bed tracks all together. You played sort of that fundamental guitar rhythm that's just going to kind of be there the whole time. And eventually it's just going to kind of blend into the background and be a texture. No one's really going to pay attention to it, but it's going to add some nice context to the song. And then you move on to that section where you're like, okay, like now, why don't you play some of the parts that people are going to
shred it?
Well, yeah, but the people, the parts that people are going to pay attention to, the parts that they're really going to bring the energy to that song. And so the really fun moments are when the musicians are so good that they don't require any coaching from the producer or any real sort of direction. They're like, oh, okay, I've got some ideas I'd love to show you. And they play it and they do a pass and they go, okay, like let me give you one more. I've got another idea. And that's also great. And okay, actually, you know what? Give me one more. I'd love to give you something else. And they just, deliver after deliver after deliver. And they're all great ideas. So those are also really fun moments to experience because you're just like, man, this is so cool. Like they are clearly inspired by what they're hearing, and they're just, they're sort of going on a musical tangent, but it's a very usable tangent, and it's awesome.
How frequently does that happen, would you say, in your experience?
It depends on the genre. On like a country session, it usually happens at least once per song.
Really?
Yeah, well, because there's usually a guitar solo of some kind.
Oh, that's a good
or some
point.
sort of guitar,
yeah,
moment that has to happen. So that usually is like, okay, like what do you got? Like what are you hearing? And they'll try it, and yeah, I mean it's not like that every time. Sometimes the producer goes, not loving that direction. Let's try something different. Start lower, maybe. Don't start up high right away. Start lower, or change X, Y, Z. So yeah, so country, it happens a fair number of times usually. rock as well, but it's usually with rock, in my experience, it usually gets a more dedicated time. So like country is usually like, if we've got 2 or 3 songs to do, it's like, okay, we'll capitalize on everybody's time. So we'll do all the bed tracks where everybody plays. We'll do that one after the other. So then like the bass player his obligations are fulfilled. So if he has somewhere to be, he can go. But if he wants to hang out, that's cool. But, everybody's done their sort of main parts already. And then it's okay, so now we switch over and we'll just focus in on guitar. And the other guys kind of come into the control room and just vibe and listen and hang. And that'll be more of like we'll just kind of throw that in there. Whereas rock is typically like, okay, like today is guitar solo day. We did everything yesterday. Today is the day we're going to spend the time and craft this stellar solo. You know what I mean? Like it kind of gets more of an intentional weight put on it because,
Okay.
I don't know if that's just because country is like, well, yeah, like it's just sort of a given. Like, yeah, guitar solo, cool. It's vibey. It's great. Whereas like in a rock song, it's like, what's an epic rock song without an epic guitar solo kind of thing, right? It was like that's the sort of mindset going into it. So there seems to be more, just more weight put on. It's just like, okay, like we're really gonna get this right. We're really gonna, this has to be crushing.
It's fun. It kind of makes me think of like a big stunts day on set or something,
right,
where it's like everyone is excited for it because you don't do like a big like donut scene and blow up a background every day kind of thing.
Yeah, or it's like like country would be like, oh, like today he's gonna jump off the truck. Cool,
Ooh.
awesome. And it's like stunts day, or it's like rock guitar. So he's gonna do a backflip off of that building and land. And you know what I mean? Like, it's like this is the moment. Everything leads to this.
Hollywood versus indie budget.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally. But yeah.
So from my perspective, it feels like in the last, like, I guess kind of like moving from the era of classic rock, it feels like as we progressed through the ages, bands have become less and less of a thing, and it's been more of a focus on independent, or not independent necessarily, but individual artists.
Yeah.
Do you think, well, for starters, like, do you have any comments or thoughts on like why that is, what happened or what changed to make that happen?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I could speculate on some ideas. And I don't know. I mean, it could be honestly largely financial. I mean, like again, like a band.
I guess it is now, like it would be on what we were talking about earlier, like as an individual artist, you can kind of make a living for yourself. But now if you have to make a living for 5 people, it's a lot
way harder.
Yeah.
Way harder. Yeah, I also think like bands are a lot of work. They really are. And to do it well is difficult. And you got to get whatever number of people are in your band to buy in all the way.
That buy-in is,
you know what I mean?
It's
just
the
like
same
they got to
for
commit,
entrepreneurial
and
projects.
everybody's got to be on the same page to like, this is what we're doing. First and foremost, cancel everything else. This is priority. And that's hard. And it takes a lot.
Super. And it like almost exponentially more difficult for every adult that you put in that
Absolutely,
agreement.
right? That gets significantly more complicated and challenging. And then you add on the financial aspect, like you had just pointed out. It's like, okay, like you're all going to do the same amount of work, but you're going to have to make it 5 times as big for it to be meaningful than if it was just one person.
Yeah.
So that's also, I think, part of it is that it's like, oh, and then again, like that availability of like, way back in the day, it's like there wasn't software instruments. You couldn't fire up your computer and be like, I'd like to play drums.
Oh,
I will play drums.
That's very
You had to
true.
find a drummer.
You needed people.
You had
for
to find
the
a drummer. You had to find a bass
instruments.
player. You had to find a guitar player. Like that was the only way to get that sound.
You couldn't just have a gorilla in a costume.
Exactly. But now it's like, oh, like I'd like an organ. Cool. Here's an organ. Or I'd like a bass. Cool. Here's a bass. One person on a laptop, individual. So there's that availability of like, oh, I don't actually need a person. I can make this happen without a person or with one producer who knows
Right.
their way around, you know, a software. So I think that the availability of that has probably played a role as well. Um, yeah, I think those are probably two pretty big contributing factors to just like people, and then and maybe that dynamic of if you have a band of 4 or 5 people and it's like there's probably I think it's more rare that they're all doing the writing. It's usually 1 to 2 people that are actually writing the songs. So then it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
it
Red
seems,
Hot Chili
it's
Peppers are like that.
right.
Yeah.
It's more sort of feasible, or it's just like, oh, like, well, we'll just write songs and then like, and then same with session musicians. I mean, it's like if you're an artist, it's still, I mean, it's easier sort of personality dynamic wise to just hire somebody for a day to come and play the songs and learn the songs and play the songs, um, than it would be to try and sort of bring a full-time person on and,
Mhm.
honor their involvement in every stage of the process. Cause that's, you know, a lot of times bands get offended. It's like, what? You went into the studio and you didn't, and I wasn't there? It's like, oh, we weren't tracking your instrument. It's like, well, yeah, but I still want to be there. Like, I still want to have input, you know,
Yeah.
which
But you
I think
worked 7 days this week.
right.
When were you gonna be here?
Exactly. Which, in some cases is fair, in some cases is it's not fair. And there's tons of bands, like everybody's a little different. You know what I mean? There's tons of bands that are like, oh yeah, I did my part. I'm done. I'm out. I'll see you guys next week. Have fun making the rest of the record. Like
Right.
that happens too. It's just like, yeah, I did my part. I played the bass. We're good. What, other people are like, no, I want to, just in case there's like a decision that needs to be made or we need to just like, I want to be involved. So,
Mhm.
you know,
I'm curious, do you have an opinion on, like, if one way is better than the other in the sense of I read this article a few years ago, and it was about kind of actually, I think it might have been about essentially how the concept of bands has started to fade out
mm,
and be more about independent or individual musicians. And it had mentioned that the kind of along the lines of like the buy-in thing and then the financial thing and like the disagreements and whatnot is a couple bands that it mentioned. Um, well, one of the originals is the Beatles. They came into it from the very beginning. They were like, "This is a four-way split. We are all equal partners. Like, this is effectively our business together." And Coldplay is an example of a more recent one that's done
yeah,
a similar thing.
yeah.
And it makes me wonder, like, those two bands that approach it in that way have become two of the largest known bands to ever exist. So, like, is there some amount of magic to that? And
I,
is that
I,
lost?
I think so. I think I heard a really good saying and I can't remember who said it, but, it said, it's amazing what you can accomplish when you don't care who gets the credit.
That is, yep,
And I think that rings true in almost
so
every
true. I almost want to
scenario.
put that on the screen in bold when we're airing this.
Yeah, well, it's a really powerful thing because there is. It's like there's definitely something to be said for people who approach a project and just say like, I'm just going to give this my best, and whatever it needs, I'm going to try and meet that need, and it ends there. And it's just like that's so good, and there's you know there's an honesty in that, and there's an
Hmm.
authenticity in that, and that will
Remove the
definitely
ego.
translate into how other people interpret that and view that because it's real and it's honest, you know? And I think it does get really convoluted when you're like, well, I suggested you sing that vocal note this way, so now I want credit for
Mhm.
producing the vocal or something like that. It's just like, okay, but it's just like, but why? It's a less I don't know. And again, I mean, some of this is just like touchy feely and it's sort of intangible of just like, yeah, but that's not the most honest or that's not the most authentic, I guess. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's honest. Like maybe if they made the suggestion, they made the suggestion. Um, I don't know. There's been certain ways of working around that sort of same scenario. Like in Nashville, it was like they had some kind of a thing where it's like if you're in the room, you get a piece of the song. It's just like that's it. It's just like if you're there, you're in kind of, and that was to just sort of free people to be like, oh, like I had a great idea, but it's like, oh, but I held it back because, they weren't going to pay me for it. And it's just like, well, then the song suffers because like it could have been way better because there was a great idea floating around that no one bothered to say because they were concerned about, who's going to get the credit for it.
Yeah.
So
I really like that strategy.
It's neat. It has its ups and downs. You know what I mean? Where it's just like, oh, like, so there's 3 people writing a song, and this person changed 3 words in the chorus, and they now have a third of the song. So there's an up and a down to it.
Yeah.
And that is going to come back to your personal approach. If you're going with like, okay, I'm going to meet the needs, I'm not going to care about the credit, then the other 2 people aren't going to be concerned that person contributed on paper less than, like if you're tallying it, but also like who's to say that the song didn't exponentially benefit from those 3 words that were different.
Maybe those 3 words are the only reason that song made it to the radio.
Right. So that's kind of those are like the kind of the compromises that you make. But either way, I think the better approach is just like, yeah, let's just make something great. Let's just do it the best we can do it. And the rest can, let the chips fall where they may kind of thing.
So I want to ask you now, pretty much ever since, actually it was only a week ago from the time of recording this,
but ever since.
Yeah. You were showing me a song that you were working on, and you identified a mouth noise in the vocal track, and you repeated it like 10 times while you were trying to figure it out, and I could not hear this mouth noise at all. But you managed to isolate it, and you pulled it out, you fixed it, and to me, I didn't hear a difference in the track. How, did you train your ears, or have they always been that way?
No.
How do you identify that?
You practice.
Listen to a 10-hour YouTube video of mouth noises?
No, but you, I guess I don't really know, but you just train. I guess it like the overarching skill will be critical listening is what you practice. And that comes from, it's not specifically like, it's being able to listen to a song and identify everything in the song. So you listen to, a song comes up, you're okay, what does the hi-hat sound like? What does the snare sound like? What does the guitar sound like? What does the drum sound like? What does the vocal sound like? What does the harmony sound like? What does the shaker sound like? Everything in the song, you practice listening to that one thing.
How do you split that up when there's like 30 tracks in the song?
Or significantly more sometimes. But well, that's just practice. I have a bit of an advantage, I guess, because playing the instruments will really, when you play it, obviously you're also practicing listening to it because you're playing.
Makes sense.
So that just kind of happens synonymously. So there's a bit of advantage to that. But yeah, I think that's the skill. And so when you can break down every sound and identify what it is, when something is not supposed to be there, it will stand out to you.
Right.
Because you're like, oh, I know what should be making sound, and I know what I expect to hear, and I've heard something that I should not have heard.
I did not add a track for mouth noises, damn
exactly,
it.
Right? Like something clicked. And then also, that comes down to editing a lot of drums. And when you edit drums, if you do it incorrectly, you'll hear a click at your edit point where you've joined 2 pieces of audio.
Oh.
So practicing listening, you edit the drums, then you have to go through and you have to listen to them. You look at them as well, but you also listen to them. And so you're listening for clicks. So that's some hours spent just listening to drums play.
Do you think it's helped you more because you're a drummer? Like, have you listened to more drum recordings because you're a drummer at all? Or I guess you probably don't.
I mean, you listen to yourself play. So like, that's kind of, it's different though, listening to recorded material than live material.
Well, yeah, you don't have the edit click if you're playing live.
Oh, so like does it help me identify stuff in songs? Just having listened? Yeah, totally. Absolutely.
You play 3 instruments?
Yeah, 4. Yeah.
Drums, guitar, bass, keys?
Yeah. A little bit of keys. I'm not like, I can get an idea across, but.
Are there any other instruments you want to learn? Or are you good with those? You just want to improve those ones?
I haven't had a ton of desire to learn other instruments. I I think that's kind of shifted. My perspective shifted pretty strongly when I got into the recording side of things, or like, you could say being on the other side of the glass.
Mm.
Um, because this is what drew me to being a producer in the first place, is that I never really had the drive to be the best player at any instrument that I've played. You know what I mean? Some people pick up a guitar and they're just like, man, I want to be able to play like that person, or as well as that person, or better than that person. Like, I want to be the best. And there's a motivation there that says, like, I want to learn every facet of this instrument, so that I want to master this instrument. But I never really felt that. I definitely have a desire to be better at all the instruments that I play. But not the best. You know what I mean? And I think, that just switched when I got into the recording side and just seeing a lot of people that play an instrument for a living. And it was just like, not to be in a discouraging way, like, oh, I'm never going to be that, but like, just really, really practically, the amount of hours it would take for me to put in and be that good. I could do it, but that means sacrificing the hours I also need to be good at recording.
Right. Those hours have to come from somewhere.
Exactly. So it's like, yes, I could do it. Anybody could do it. If you put in the hours and you get the training, you can do anything that you want. But for me, it was that trade-off of like, well, to me, there's not enough like reward just for me in my head. If I were to put those hours in, it's like, great, now I'm phenomenal at this instrument. It's like, cool, but I'm still going to want to do the recording side of things. But now I'm not. Now I have to start from scratch on those hours, and you only got so many years in your life. So, you know what I mean? So it was one of those things where it's just like, oh, like, I'm actually perfectly happy if someone else is really good at the instrument. And I would love to just sit back and collaborate with that person and say, hey, like, I was actually thinking, or here's what I was kind of hearing. Can we try something like this? And meet them sort of in the middle of their skill and experience and my skill and experience and someone else's skill and experience, and put those things together to make something awesome.
So it sounds
something larger like than that individual could
down
make.
The producer route.
Yeah.
Eventually, yeah.
Yeah, that's the end game for me.
Okay.
But yeah, like that idea, the classic idea of just you make something greater than what one person, like I've never wanted to be. I'd love to be the person that brings together the right pieces to make something bigger than, the sum of its parts kind of thing. Or like,
I very much resonate with that.
Yeah, bigger than those individuals could maybe accomplish by themselves. That's kind of what gets me really fired up.
Oh, okay. So this is on kind of the power of belief, and kind of in relation to the hours spent practicing and whatnot. Is over the last year, I had a realization that a lot of the world's biggest, most popular artists have a song about being the greatest or being the best, like whether it's in their specific genre or music, or like as a player of a specific instrument or a lyricist or whatever have you. A lot of them have some comment in some of their music about being the best. How do you think that plays into how well a musician does in their career? And like, do you think, like, is it enough to believe it and sing about it? Or like, do you have to get to a point where the world now recognizes you as the greatest before you can release one of those songs?
Well, I'm not sure. I don't think you have to get to that point where the world recognizes you, but I do think that there's definitely a need, as an artist, like you have to want to be great. And I think it's easier to set the goal as being the best than it is to set the goal of, well, I'd like to be among the top 10. You know what I mean?
That's true. It doesn't have
significantly
quite
less
the same
motivating
punch to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So like, that's kind of like, that's that sort of shoot for the moon mentality.
Also a lot more wordy to put into a song.
You're right. Yeah. I'd like to be recognized as like overall really good. So yeah. So I think it's easier to just like as a state of mind. You're just like, no, I need to push. I need to put in as much work as it takes until I am the best at what I do. Um, I think that's a pretty necessary framework because it's really hard. And I think if you are not motivated by that, you will probably, you know, you'll probably stop at some point in time or along the way or hit a level. You're like, you know what? I'm good here. And that's also fine. You know what I mean? Like, not everybody is meant to be the
There is
best at
something to be
everything.
said for appreciating what you've accomplished.
Yeah. So you know, but yeah, as a starting point, I think, yeah, put that, like, set that goal and set that goal high. Because I think that's important. And I think that's a neat thing about a lot of producers is that, um, I don't know, a lot. Some of the producers that I've come in contact with have had artist careers at one point in time. So they kind of went down that route and you know, had varying degrees of success, but at some point kind of realized like that artist grind is not for me. And that's not what I want to do. Um, but through that, they gained a lot of skills and a lot of experience that can now help other people.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's like that sort of like, oh, like I want to use what I have to facilitate making other things great. So then, hence, enter the role of the producer. Um, so yeah, I think you'll never lose if you set your standards very high and you aim to be the best, because the skills that you gain in that pursuit you'll always have, and
Absolutely.
you don't know
Yes.
the other applications for those skills that will present themselves when you change your perspective, right? Because everything we do we view through a lens, usually of whatever goal you set.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, okay, I want to be the best. Okay, so that means these 5 things need to happen, and we start knocking those things down. And then we get to number 4, let's say, and we're like, you know what? Maybe by that point, I can see the end. I can see my destination. And I'm starting to realize that if I take those next 2 steps and I get to that destination, it's not going to be everything I thought it was going to be. And you're like, okay.
Ooh. I wonder how many people have gotten there and then stopped because of that thought.
I don't know. But I think it's a real, I think it's a real thing. Or, and this kind of goes back to like really appreciating the journey over the destination, because
Mm-hmm.
I do feel like there's also some people and some artists who like, okay, like I want to have a number 1 hit. I want to sell the most albums. I want to do this sort of thing. And they accomplish that thing. And it's like, oh, well, now what? Like my whole purpose of my career and really what I've made my life's work is to get to this point. And now I've gotten there, but I still have life left. So it's like, wow, okay, so that's also a difficult point to reach. And some people have reached that, but you know what? I think going back, I think you can't lose if you set your goals really high, because even if you do get halfway through and you change your perspective, you're like, okay, well, I've gained all of these skills or this knowledge and this experience. And now what lens do I put in to widen that and apply that to other things?
One of my favorite lyrics from any song, which has become a little more contentious now because it's a Kanye West lyric.
Right.
Reach for the stars, so if you fall, you land on the clouds.
Right.
Ever since graduation came out in high school, that lyric has given me motivation.
Yeah, totally.
Um,
I heard a similar one. It's shoot for the moon, and even if you missed, you'll land among the stars. I don't know where that came from, but it's one of those things that floats around. Same thing.
Yeah. I would love to talk a little bit about your musical experience, or not experience, but inspiration before we wrap up today.
Cool.
Like what kind of, to start, like when you were younger, what got you into playing instruments? Was it there the specific bands, groups, or like your parents just put you in? Why
man.
did you pick the instruments that you learned?
Good question. So, to start, I started really young. There was this program, I think it was only in Ontario, called Music for Young Children. And so mom...
Nobody strained any brain cells on that name.
Yeah, I know. Right? But so I started at 3 years old, trying to learn piano.
They could
And
have
it
added a
was
very into the young children part.
yes, yeah. So very heavy on the parental involvement. Obviously, like mom had to sit there with me and probably like hold me up basically and try and teach me these things. Um, so I did that for a bit, and then uh, a rhythm came. I kind of just always had it, as far as I can
Oh,
tell.
lucky.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sciencey stuff that you could get into. So my mom loved to dance, and so in her words, she danced. She says every day when she was pregnant with me, and babies have a fully functioning auditory system after 20 weeks, so the baby can hear everything that happens
Really?
after 20 weeks. So you could argue that those neural pathways, excuse me, started getting developed really early,
Huh.
just a sense of rhythm, and so
So my mom didn't listen to enough music.
I think I will say it's my belief that it's beneficial to listen to music anyway when you're pregnant. Um, and she put me in dance lessons as well at yeah, like again, probably 3 or 4 years old or
I
something like
believe you
that.
just said 20 weeks.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yes, correct. Yes, she put me in dance lessons at 20 weeks. Yeah, exactly. But no, and then when I was 3 or 4, she put me in lessons as well, and so I did that till I was 11. Um, and then I think around 8 years old, I could, I had the facility to play rhythms, and I could match what was happening on a whatever music I was listening to. So that was just kind of cool. And then it was church that got me playing instruments. Drums were my first. Well, if you count 3 years old, piano was my first, but drums were my first interest in music. Like I was like, piano was there, and I also took piano lessons at some
Kind
point
of
in
an
time.
adorable thought to a 3-year-old playing piano, because like your hand is like the size of a single key.
A key, exactly.
You're
You're
playing
like, all right, I got
chopsticks
this
with a whole
one.
hand.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so drums kind of came first, and then I took piano lessons, and then I think bass was after that, and then guitar was after that, and then kind of circled back around to drums. It's funny, there's kind of different stages of my life where I kind of just switched instruments and made that my thing, and then made that my thing, and then it's circled back to primarily drums now. But I still, sort of along the lines of what I was saying, I still have those skills. I can still play bass, I can still play guitar, even though it's not my main thing now, but
That's
I
the
made it
beauty
my
of
main thing
growth and
for a
learning,
bit.
is that you always have those skills.
Exactly. So, yeah. But yeah, so inspiration, I didn't start playing because of any particular artist.
Oh, I
It
mean,
was,
if you were 3, then
yes, but no, but even drums, like it was, yeah, right, yeah. But it was church. So I grew up playing music in church, and then, yeah, I mean, out of that, it was kind of, I don't know. I was raised super religious, so I actually missed a lot of all of my musical influences at a young age were all Christian bands. So I actually
Oh,
didn't,
so I don't know any of them. Is
no,
what you're
exactly. Yeah.
saying.
So like my buddy, like friends of mine grew up listening to the Aerosmiths and the AC/DC and stuff. I didn't get any of that.
Ooh.
Yeah. So, or even even stuff like the Beatles, like people like their parents would play them, like the Beatles or whatever, insert major historical band here. Didn't get any of that. So that was interesting. Yeah, I always just loved music. I always got super excited. I loved finding bands and discovering music, and I would always just get really into it. And yeah, and then when I moved away from home, continued playing music in church, and then eventually got into a band, and then we did that recording that I talked about at the beginning of the episode. Met a producer for the first time, and then some years later, after having a couple different jobs and just hitting some financial goals and realizing like, okay, cool, like I could continue on this path and keep doing that. But I felt like there were skills that I wasn't utilizing. Okay, well, I love music. I'm passionate about it. I know a little bit about it at this point, and so I'm gonna looked up recording schools, and I'm gonna try and see if I can use those skills as my everyday thing. And so far I've been able to do that for the most part. It's always a bit of a juggling act because the music industry is always up and down. But yeah, that's been the journey for the last 7 or 8 years.
What made you choose Vancouver for your school instead of staying in Alberta or going
Well,
back east?
I don't know if there is a specific recording school in Alberta. There's probably one somewhere. I had met somebody in Alberta who had gone to a school in Vancouver.
Mm.
And so, yeah, that was probably just partially a result of Google. I'm sure I just Googled recording schools, and a couple of them came up in
The
Vancouver. and
closest one is
probably none of them-
4,000 kilometers
probably
away.
none of them came up in Alberta. So I was like, okay, so I guess it's Vancouver. And then I had met someone who came to the one out here that I went to, and kind of recommended it and had some nice things to say. So, yeah, that's what turned me on to that, and then decided to pull the trigger and move out.
What do you have favorite artists for specific moods? Like, is there an artist that, like, every time you're, like, happy or you want to feel a certain way, you listen to this artist, or, like, every time you're sad, you listen to this artist?
No, there are definitely I think there are certain vibes. It's not so much a mood. It's more influenced on what is happening around me versus what I'm feeling internally. So yeah, I think I very much listen to music based on like what music do I feel matches what I'm seeing or what I'm experiencing. I try and pair those up.
Interesting.
Yeah. So if it's dull and rainy, or if it's sunny and clear, or if it's hot, if it's cold, if it's and then and that's not always the case. Sometimes I'll just throw on kind of whatever and see what sometimes it's not specific. I'm not into
Right.
it. I'm not after a specific experience or feeling. I still like discovering music a lot, although I find it doesn't happen as much.
I have noticed that too, despite the fact there seems to be like 8,000 times more musicians on streaming services.
Yeah.
It is harder and harder to find.
But that means there's 8,000 less things that are new, right?
That's true.
That's
Yeah.
what people made the argument that, like the Beatles with like the most number one hits. And it's just like, yeah, like you could sneeze into a microphone in that day and age and it was a number one hit because no one had ever done it before. You know what I mean? So there's an interesting conversation to be had there about how so many less things had been explored and had been tried and been done. So everything had that sort of magic dust. It was like, oh my gosh, this is revolutionary.
That's such
We've
a
never
good
heard
point.
anything like this before. And every artist that comes along since then is influenced by somebody, is taking from the person that came before them in a different way, possibly, or maybe in the same way. And so, yeah, that plays a lot into like even, since my high school days to now, I would find a new band, several new bands a week.
Oh,
in high
right. It
school.
was
You know what I
so
mean? It was just
easy.
like, oh, I love these guys. I love this. This sounds great. These guys are awesome. And then, yeah, now it's funny. It's like that nostalgia a little bit has kicked in of like, oh, like I listened to this music because I remember the way I felt when I found it.
Yep.
And that still feels good.
Oh man, nostalgia is the emotion of millennials.
The Office, man's greatest weakest, second only to the neck.
And that's such a good point, because to me, at least a little bit, it kind of feels like there is, which I guess probably comes back to the funding and the budget bit, but it feels to me like not as many people are putting the effort and energy into crafting like an actual album as a listening experience.
Right.
And like definitely there's lots of musicians putting out singles, which I guess is probably where the budget bit comes in, right?
Yeah,
like
well,
if you say it
that's
costs
due
10
to-
grand for a single, then
I mean, it varies greatly.
yeah.
But, yeah. But no, that's definitely dependent. That's like due to sort of how the music industry and distribution played a lot into that as well, because way back in the day, it's like starting out, the only place you could hear music was the radio. So like if you think about putting an album on, it's like you're not going to put on the whole album. You'll put on a song, and then like a month later, you'll put on the next song. If you think of how long it would take to go through an album that way, albums lasted forever.
That's a
Right?
good point.
Like,
yeah.
4 singles, the only time you can hear it is when it comes on the radio Or if you buy the album,
Yeah.
it's like, oh man, this is awesome. Like that's the, it was so narrow. The access to music was so limited.
I guess it's kind of a similar thing for like what the streaming services did to TV. Like everyone became so used to binging things now
Exactly.
that nobody remembers what happens in a show.
Exactly. So they're very similar to that. So again, like, this distribution got so wide, and also global. I remember that too. People talking about the Beatles, because the Beatles had this crazy, crazy uprising in the UK before the US knew who they were. And then it happened all over again when they finally came to the US, which is wild. Whereas here, as soon as somebody knows about it in one country, chances are pretty good someone everywhere else knows about it.
There's
too.
even decent odds you're more famous somewhere else already than you are in your own country.
But the point is it's happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? So you don't get that longevity of your project. Everyone gets it all at the same time. They listen to it because they have the whole thing whenever they want it.
It really amplifies the 15 minutes of fame thing, because like everyone's attention span, you get that much time and then they move on to the next one.
Yeah, totally. And then again, layering on top of that, you widen the fact, like you said, there's so many more artists and everyone's vying for someone's attention. So the strategy became, well, okay, if you get, let's say, if a song's worth 10 minutes of someone's attention, but by, number of times they listen to it, whatever, I'm picking arbitrary numbers. But if one song gets you 10 minutes of that person's attention, then it's better to grab 10 minutes of their time here with a single, wait 3 months, grab another 10 minutes of their time with a single, wait 3 months, rather than grab 15 minutes of their time with an album that took you a year and a half to finish fully, or whatever, a year, let's say. To write, or if you count writing, it's probably longer. But,
Probably,
to write and record and mix and this whole process. And it's like, okay, but, diminishing returns, because that's going to they're going to burn through that album and then they're going to forget about it. And then it's going to take you another 2 years, in which case they're going to forget about you, grab 17 new artists that they like more or that they like equally. But either way, you're going to kind of fall down to the bottom of that pile a little bit until you can grab someone's attention again. Maybe,
it's kind of intimidating when you say it like that.
It's tough. It's a tough business, man. It really is. Being an artist is tough.
It's in so many ways I've realized how similar, like the whole, I guess similar to the producer roles in film. And like, I guess what I'm trying to say is being a musician or being a like film producer, they're very similar in a lot of ways to being an entrepreneur, in the way that like you are almost a singular champion or a small group of champions for this idea and project that like the rest of the world, if they even knows about, like how much do they care? Probably not at all. And now you need to convince them that this thing is amazing.
Right. Yeah.
And it can be incredibly discouraging and a long road, unless you manage to find the joy in the process.
Right.
Now, I would like to finish on a slightly more upbeat note than that one. So we
slightly more upbeat than being an artist is hard.
Yeah. I had another question for you earlier too, and now I totally forgot what it was. Oh, yeah. So, curiosity. How often do you listen to music that you've worked on, like tracks that you've mixed? Do you spend a lot of time listening to your own stuff?
No, not that often.
Is that a common thing for mixers, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Listen, well, so in the course of the mixing process, you'll listen to it enough.
Well, yeah, like when you're finding that mouth noise, you repeat that tiny section of music like 30 times.
You equally I mean, it's probably different. I don't quite have, the revolving door of like, I'm not always working on new stuff. My projects are a little bit more spread out. So for me, it's like those songs live in my brain already. Like I can press play on that song anytime I want. I don't need any piece of technology because it's in there. So I'm sure that diminishes a lot for people who would work on, let's say, like a different song every day, like a full-time mixing engineer who's just always working on stuff. That might not happen to the same extent for them. And maybe one day it won't happen to that extent for me. But no, I don't. I will still listen to it from time to time, to just get that perspective again, and kind of like, maybe it's to compare, or maybe it's just to go back and enjoy or remember. But yeah, it's not very often. Would be the answer.
I feel like pretty much every time I've heard someone talk about, like if it's a podcaster talking about their own podcasts, or like an actress talking about their movie,
Right.
or like, it's always that same thing. Like,
Yeah.
I hate going back and watching it, or like, no, I don't want to see it after it's done, or it's just like, no, as soon as I walk off set, I forget about it. Like,
I think part of the reason for me is that a lot of times, sort of touching again on that growth journey that you're kind of on as you move through your life and your career and stuff like that, is that my general reaction is, when I hear something that I've worked on, especially like a longer period of time ago, is I just hear stuff I want to change. So like that's another reason where it's like there was a joke in recording school. It's like you don't ever finish a mix. You just give up on it. Because honestly, you can endlessly change things.
Dude,
Forever.
I've felt that so much in my writing even.
Right.
Like every time I do an editing pass, I'll get to a sentence and it'd be like, I change a few words in it and then I reread it again and I was like, still doesn't feel right. Change a few words and then change it 3 more times and then it's back to the way it was at the start, and then you're like, but that's still not right.
Yeah, then it's just up to you saying like, is this good? Is this better than it was? Is it not? But that's
now you're just stuck in a thought loop.
Well, and it's just your perspective, right? So that's the running joke, is that like, no, you just gave up on it. So that's kind of also part of it, is like, that's, no matter how good or bad or good it was, there's forever going to be things that I was like, oh, I would change that if I did it again.
So do you, like, does that also happen while you're listening to just like random music? Do you ever listen to it and think like, oh man, I would have done this different, or I would have liked to change this?
Yep.
Because that happens to me with reading all the fucking time.
Yep.
I read a sentence, I'm like, no, they fucked that sentence up.
For sure, yeah. I hear things. I mean, I try not to approach it with a better or worse scenario, because a lot of things, a lot of scenarios you don't know until you try. So it's more of a like, oh, I would be very curious to hear if this happened.
Neat to see it this way.
If it makes me feel how I think it would make me feel.
It's a lot easier for writing because I can just like, how does this sound in my head if I read it like this?
Yeah.
That sounds cleaner.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely curiosities, or, I mean, rarely there's times where it's just like, oh, that should not have gone there, but that doesn't happen very often.
Have you ever found like an errant mouth noise?
Yes. There are songs that I can't listen to. Because of
how common is it?
Breaths that didn't get taken out, or mouth. Usually it's not a bunch of mouth noises. Usually it's just one.
It's like one thing that they missed.
Yeah, and it's just like, I don't know. That one is not like I can't listen to. The breath one though, there's one that I just can't do it. I'm sorry guys, it's not for me. But yeah, and then the mouth noise is just like a disappointment, because it's just like, oh man, like, it's so obvious, like, guys, and everything else is so good, like
the Starbucks cup in Game of Thrones.
Yeah. Except someone didn't put that in there. Anyway.
Yeah. All right. On that note, thank you so much for finally being on the show. You gave me a lot of education about the music world. Wonderful. And hopefully more of it will stick this time than... I mean, lots of it stick last time.
Well,
some of the things were
me.
Repeated for...
On the other side of that door.
Yeah. I'll ask you questions while I'm talking to someone else on the podcast.
That's just rude. Don't do that.
All right, I think we're good, Adam. Oh, actually, first, is there anyone or anything you want to give a shout out to?
Nah. All the podcasts on Omnia Theater.
Aw, thanks. All right, bye, everyone. Thank you so much for hanging out with us today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please get involved by leaving a comment below, and don't forget to click those buttons to like and subscribe. Without further ado, here's Dreams by Fleetwood Mac in the style of Earl Jenkins.
Well, here you go again. You say you want your freedom. Well, who am I to keep you down? It's only right that you should play the way you feel, but listen carefully to the sound of your loneliness, like a heartbeat drives you mad. In the stillness of remembering what you had, oh, what you lost, and what you had, and what you lost. Oh, thunder only happens when it's raining. Players only love you when they're playing. I said, oh, women, they will come and they will go. And when the rain washes you clean, you know, you know. Well, here I go again. I see the crystal visions. I keep my visions to myself. It's only me who wants to wrap around your dreams. Have you any dreams you'd like to sell? Dreams of loneliness, like a heartbeat drives you mad. In the stillness of remembering what you had, oh, what you lost, and what you had, and what you lost. Oh, thunder only happens when it's raining. Players only love you when they're playing. I said, oh, women, they will come and they will go. When the rain washes you clean, you know, you know. And I've become a simple souvenir of someone's care. And like the sea, constantly changing from calm to air. Madness fills my heart and soul as if a great divide could swallow me whole. Oh, how I'm breaking down. Well, thunder only happens when it's raining. And players only love you when they're playing. I said, oh, women, they will come and they will go. And when the rain washes you clean, you know, oh, thunder only happens when it's raining. Players only love you when they're playing. I said, oh, women, they will come and they will go. And when the rain washes you clean, you know. I said, oh, when the rain washes you clean, you know. Could it be this misery will suffice? Could it be this misery will suffice? Could it be this misery fight.